Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the Roundtable discussion on key services policy issues, what role for the WTO? I welcome warmly all participants, our distinguished panelists, and our moderator, Director of the Trade and Services and Investment Division, Ms. Xiaolin Chai. I'd like to invite those who can, of course, to turn on your camera to perhaps ensure better interactivity with our speakers. And we reserved an hour and a half for this roundtable discussion. And I now turn over to Madame Chai. Have a good roundtable. Enjoy.
Thank you very much, Alicia. Ladies and gentlemen, greetings to you all. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the roundtable, and it is a great honor for me to moderate the discussion today. For the last 2 years, the COVID pandemic has brought unprecedented social and economic impact on our daily lives. We see paradigm and the trade pattern shifts prompted by digitization and climate change, which started before and accelerated during the pandemic. Services and services trade are at the center of all these transformative changes. And so when the world is going more digital, greener, and better prepared for the future, what are the key services policy issues? And what is the role for the WTO? This is the central theme of our roundtable discussion today. Now, a few words about the arrangement for our discussion. The discussion will consist of 2 rounds of interventions. The first round of interventions by our panelists will take about 30 to 35 minutes. If you have questions for the presenters or wish to share your comments, please put them in the Q&A chat box, and I will pick them up as we go along. So with these quick remarks, I'd like to proceed with our panelists. We are very grateful today that we have been able to secure a very distinguished panel for this discussion. And so let's hear from them. Our first panelist is Mr. Hamid Mamadou. Hamid is a senior counsel at King & Spalding and a visiting professor at the Center for Commercial Law Studies of the Queen Mary University of London. Hamid was my predecessor, and he was the director of the Trading Services and Investment Division from 2001 and 2017. Prior to that, during the Uruguay round, his responsibilities included legal matters relating to the negotiation and the drafting of the General Agreement on Trade in Services. So Hamid, thank you for joining us. Digitization, supply chain resilience, and the agility and environmental sustainability have become everyday focuses of governments, business communities, and international organizations. In view of these, and to kick off our discussion, I prepared a few questions for you, but feel free to go wider and broader if you wish. My questions are, what are, in your view, the key services issues for the future, and what can the WTO do about them? What needs to happen for members to address these issues in the WTO? And what is the risk if these issues are not addressed by the WTO? So now over to you, Hamid.
Well, thank you very much, Xiaolin, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to feel at home once again with friends and colleagues and a subject matter that is so close to my heart. as you all know. The way you set up the scene, Xiaolin, provides a very, very broad horizon. And I will try my best to, in 10 minutes, just give you an idea about what my view would be on the questions that you've raised. First of all, as you said, the importance of services has come to the forefront in terms of how critical services are, and in particular the process of digitalization with the COVID-19 experience, which had a lot of negative sides to it, but at the same time, the blessing in the situation was the technological tools that enabled us to mitigate the severe effect of such a disaster. Now, if you ask me about what is the biggest issue in terms of services and services trade in the WTO, I would say the first problem really is that the services agenda in the WTO has been abandoned for 25 years. We have not actually updated the GATS, and the GATS was designed with built-in mechanisms to update both the schedules as well as disciplines in the agreement. So there are these two dimensions of market access commitments and of course national treatment, but the access commitments. And on the other side, there is this complex, highly complex process of developing regulatory disciplines. And we have not really done much, with the exception of the last domestic regulation, JSI outcome, which I think came as a breath of fresh air, a long-awaited kind of positive outcome. Now, that is the big issue really. And if we try to unpack this and say, okay, what can we start with? In other words, if we by a magic wand today find that governments and members of the WTO are interested to, resume the services agenda, which is a built-in agenda, as we all know. Article 19 speaks of successive rounds of negotiations. So all the legal and institutional and procedural infrastructure is already there. But if members mobilize the political will today and start negotiations, what I would think of as an area for immediate focus would be digital trade. It's very obvious. Digital trade on both sides, the market access side and the regulatory disciplines development side. Now, if we just take a quick look at the reality on both things, market access and regulatory disciplines. On market access, actually, autonomous liberalization has been advancing very well, in a very unstructured way, but it has been advancing, and it's always advancing autonomously out of what I would call enlightened self-interest by governments who open up their services markets. But this is not really captured anywhere. On the regulatory side, regulatory disciplines have not been advancing, while on the ground, regulatory responses to all sorts of digitally driven phenomena have been proliferating. Now, I think that what we've seen over the past 20 years is that all those technology-driven innovative business models have given rise to regulatory responses in different jurisdictions by regulators who are pursuing different policy objectives, whether it's privacy, cybersecurity, online consumer protection, securing electronic payments, whatever it is their objective. The reality is that they don't think of trade. They are focused on their own objectives, and the regulatory responses are so often restrictive. They run in the opposite direction of what trade negotiators are trying to do. And this makes us face again this problem about not having updated the regulatory disciplines in the WTO for the past 25 years. Because the role of regulatory disciplines in the face of these kind of legitimate regulatory responses is actually that trade disciplines try to ensure the least trade restrictiveness, the transparency and the least trade restrictiveness of regulatory interventions without encroaching on regulatory sovereignty. So what we say to regulators from a trade policy perspective is, do whatever you need to do to pursue your legitimate policy objectives, but please, please, please try to use the least trade restrictive means. Now, it's simple when you describe it like this, but when it comes to the breakdown of what this means in terms of different regulatory domains, it becomes a very, very complex conversation, which needs to take place yesterday. And we haven't actually been doing this for several years. Now, what can be done in the face of this current situation? Now, if we agree that this is the area we need to focus on, digital trade, because of its importance and its expansion, and also because of its complexity, then what can we do? And I immediately think of three things that can be done. And I'm sure that, Stuart, this would sound familiar to you because we had discussed this before. The first thing is, if we get into a negotiation, I would say let's agree that we will bind existing situations. Let's bind status quo. There is already a good degree of openness. Let's bind it. Now, binding existing situations, although it does not actually provide new market opening, it actually has tremendous benefits. The first benefit, obviously, is providing legal certainty. Legal certainty is terribly important for companies and for businesses because it provides them with planning horizon that feeds into investment decisions and job creation and all this. But apart from the legal certainty, another huge benefit of binding existing situations is that, according to the architecture of the GATS itself, there are so many disciplines about good governance in the GATS that kick in only when you have a commitment in your schedule. So if you expand the scope of coverage of schedules, you immediately expand the scope of application of a lot of important disciplines in the GATS, including, for example, something like the obligation to allow cross-border data flows for the purpose of supplying services listed in your schedule. So that would be the first thing. The second thing I would say we could do is to invite governments to focus on doing a little more effort in certain sectors which are particularly important for e-commerce, particularly important for digital trade. And I would immediately think of sectors like telecommunications, ICT services, express delivery, logistics, distribution, electronic payment services, because even though most people think about merchandise trade when they talk about e-commerce, but actually, when you think about how an e-commerce transaction takes place, as I always say, you can't buy it, you can't sell it, you can't move it if you don't have the services that allow the transaction to be concluded. So that would be the second thing I would suggest. Let's make a particular effort on these critical sectors, because opportunities are huge, but there are problems there. And the third thing is to try hard to develop regulatory disciplines on some of the priority issues that have been raised in the area of digital trade or e-commerce. And by the way, a lot of those sort of regulatory disciplines, negotiations, may actually involve the clarification of existing disciplines in the GATS and see how, A, we can clarify, B, how we can take it forward and make it more effective. Example, again, that comes to mind here is the existing disciplines on cross-border data flows. And sometimes I hear conversations as if there are no disciplines or no legal obligations on cross-border data flows, which is actually not true at all. So these would be the three things that I would suggest we can focus on. The last part of your question, Xiaolin, and it's not really a question, it's like an invitation for a thesis, but I'm trying to compress so many things in 10 minutes, is what would happen if we don't do anything on services in the WTO. What will happen actually is that we will continue to have uncertainty, lack of certainty, and this is the worst thing for business, a lack of certainty. The second is that we will have a lower standard of good governance in trade relations and even in implementing legitimate regulations because of the lack of development of trade, of regulatory disciplines. The third thing is that I think we're going to suffer from more regulatory diversity. Because if you think about the problem across different countries, in e-commerce or in digital trade, what we're talking about really is cross-border and cross-jurisdictional business being conducted and being facilitated. Now, as a natural matter, the more regulatory diversity you have between different jurisdictions, the more trade inhibiting it will be. And one of the great functions of regulatory disciplines under the GATS is to mitigate this effect of regulatory diversity across jurisdictions in order to facilitate cross-border trade. So if we do nothing, we will suffer from more regulatory diversity. And of course, the sad thing in a situation like that is that the countries that would suffer the most are the countries that actually don't call the shots. The countries that and the jurisdictions that need those opportunities most. And again, part of the beauty of multilateral rulemaking, or even if rulemaking is taking place plurilaterally, like reference papers and so forth, the beauty of that is that collective rulemaking makes a lot of countries rule makers as opposed to rule takers. And that is a very inclusive angle in whatever can be done in the WTO. Now, I think I've taken a bit more than my 10 minutes, so let me stop here, and I'll be more than interested to hear what others have to say and participate in the discussion as well. Thank you so much, and back to you, Xiaolin.
Thank you very much, Hamid, and for your very insightful views on these questions, and your points and highlights are very well explained and presented. And just to recap a little bit, is that your call for services agenda to be resumed in the WTO and focusing on digital trade, and all your suggestions on the few sectors that are critical for e-commerce, and also your kindly, very candid warning that if nothing happens, that we will continue to be facing the lack of certainty. So very, very insightful and thought stimulating. Thank you very much. So now I come to our second panelist, Mr. Sumanta Chaudhary. Sumanta worked for the Indian Administrative Service and is a distinguished international trade specialist covering a number of areas, notably trade and industry, with almost 2 decades of dealing with multilateral, plurilateral, bilateral trade issues. He was Joint Secretary as well as Director of India's Department of Commerce and headed the Trade Policy Division in charge of WTO issues and FTA negotiations. He also served as counselor in the Permanent Mission of India to the WTO and was India's main negotiator on services in the Doha round. So without further ado, Sumanta, services and services trade have been increasingly gaining traction in the national and international policy debate. Nevertheless, the issues on the table are like some sort of decorating the Christmas trees. So I invite you to share your perspectives on some of the questions which Hamid has just expanded, and share with us what do you think are the key services issues for the future, and what the WTO can do about them, and what needs to happen for members to address these issues in the WTO, and what is the risk if these issues are not addressed by the WTO. Of course, I would like particularly welcome your insights on what is at stake for developing countries and what role should they play. So now the floor is yours, Samantha.
Thanks, Yao. And once again, let me thank the WTO for giving me this opportunity of sharing views. It's particularly great to see old colleagues and dear friends, and so wonderful. But of course, coming after Hamid is always easier, because Hamid does it so well that it makes it easier. And I've always followed this principle, so nothing new. Hamid was the one who used to take off, and I used to simply follow him. So I'll do that again. No, jokes apart, I think the very obvious candidate, as Hamid said, and as you laid the sort of ground rules, is digital trade and digital economy. And I know this is sort of an area of, well, I would say a lot of divergence as well. And particularly since you did put the developing country perspective also, I will try and sort of, so therefore there is a lot of divergence as far as the digital trade goes. But I think what is completely, I think, without any challenge is the power, the reach, and the inventiveness of the digital economy. I think that nobody questions. It's really to what extent you have binding rules or binding disciplines versus you know, a more gradualized approach where more policy space is available. But certainly this is going to be the top of the agenda. It's a fact that virtually everything that you can conceive of is being sort of delivered digitally, and that will increasingly happen. So this is certainly a challenge. I agree with Hamid that in a sense, you know, we in the WTO are 25 years behind, and we've had this journey together, Hamid, for a long time. When we saw this, unfortunately, I think, yes, the last sort of significant liberalization happened, and it's now completely, I would say, it doesn't matter anymore. 97 and 2022, 25 years. And of course, the JSI on DR is something that I agree with Hamid is certainly welcome. And I do believe that there is, and I'll come back to that, I do think that there's a scope for increasing that kind of regulatory cooperation in the WTO. But coming more to digital trade, and of course, I think the issues are well known. And one of the issues that Hamid raised, and I would also like, is the, you know, we all know that domestic regulatory frameworks are absolutely critical for the development of the digital economies. And obviously, developing countries are struggling, more so probably in Africa and other parts of the world. But you need laws on data protection, you need them on online consumer protection, you need electronic transaction laws, you need cyber protection, you name them. So you have all kinds of domestic regulatory frameworks, and different developing countries are at different stages of developing them and trying to find the right balance in their own domestic regulatory frameworks, leave alone global or international for the time being. I think the first balance that many of them have to find is within their domestic economies, and that is something which is very much work in process. It's ongoing. But yes, as Hamid said, since you're talking of cross-border data flows and jurisdictions, regulatory convergence or harmonization will become an issue, or at least compatibility between the frameworks that you develop. If they are completely incomparable or incompatible, then obviously they would lead to issues in cross-border data flows. So certainly down the line, this is going to become an issue of, to the extent to which such harmonization or regulatory convergence, at least to some extent, both regionally and I think this is something that possibly will happen more regionally. That's my own sort of view, though I am of course a great believer in multilateralism. I would love to see it happen more in the WTO arena, but it's possible that these kinds of convergence, and we are seeing that, we are seeing, you know, standalone digital trade agreements already. I think this trend has started with Singapore, and this is increasingly happening in all the regional trade agreements with even those developing countries which may have issues in the WTO in talking about digital trade. You find chapters and you find maybe softer stuff on e-commerce. So in the regional space, in the sort of FTAs that you are doing, or even in standalone digital agreements, you will have issues which will tackle both the substantive issues of, you know, data localization, issues of source codes, etc., etc. And those could be particularly important for developing countries for transfer of technology. And what would governments consider as legitimate public policy objectives. So that's one part. Another part which I think is likely to become important, and again with the, you know, with customs duties on goods and with so many free trade agreements now being signed all over, obviously the preferential duties are either zero or pretty close to zero, and therefore even in developing economies where customs duties are still relatively important, the customs duties on goods obviously is not going to become a huge source of revenue. And therefore the emphasis on services and how you can tax the digital economy in different ways. We all know that the OECD has come out with this multilateral sort of tax treaty, which certainly covers part of the problem of, but not the entire thing. We know that one track of this digital tax treaty does deal with the issue of revenues generated where the businesses are located rather than the place of where they are located. So, but there are going to be, I think, attempts for the time being. Digital service tax maybe is off the table. People would probably wait, countries would wait to see how the OECD tax treaty actually pans out in the next 2 years. But I think this is going to be an issue. It's not necessarily something that will only happen in the WTO, but certainly there will be an issue. We'd all know now that unlike in '98 when this agenda was first started, you can track and evaluate and sort of electronic transmissions, and therefore taxation is certainly technologically feasible, and some countries have already embarked on this road. So I do think that this is an area where I think there will be I would say increase, and we all know that unlike, you know, in some sense the model of governance which was prevalent maybe a decade or so ago, where, you know, least governance, government sticking to minimum, but both, I would say, the experience during COVID, the digital divide, all that points to more government spending, and therefore the need for government revenues is only going to increase, particularly in developing economies. And we know that there is a huge digital divide, which is the third, which brings me to the third aspect. This is, I mean, both within and between countries, we do know a digital divide. Now, even for the purpose of domestic development of the digital economy, and obviously for any foreign service suppliers to do it, you need to bridge this divide. So as Hamid mentioned, all those service sectors that he was talking of, whether it's telecom infrastructure, the broadband penetration, the laying of optical fibers, telecom towers, etc. So huge capital investments are required in order to bridge this digital divide. And obviously, these needs are far more in developing countries than in the developed world. And there is both, therefore, an opportunity and a challenge. And therefore, the kind of both market access commitments that you have in these services and the regulatory disciplines that you've built. A case in example is telecom, where we did have a reference paper, but that's again 25 years old. The whole telecom world has changed. You need to have a regulatory principle paper that is far more in line with what is happening today. So that is going to be an important, could be an important agenda, I think, both for, in a sense, removing the digital divide and for allowing greater digital transformation of including the developing world. On the domestic regulatory side, I do think that the JSI on DR, while it has largely in some sense covered more the issues of transparency, whether it is with licensing or qualification or technical standards, certainly there is scope to do more. Obviously, as Hamid said, there are all built-in mandates. We all know about Article 6.4. I do think that as in some sense, as we move on and autonomously, countries have liberalized a large part on the FDI front. So Mode 3 today is far more open in large parts of the world than it was when these negotiations were last held. And therefore, the challenge more is in the regulatory kind of disciplines. And as Hamid said, what kind of regulations are the domestic regulators? Are these trade restrictive? Are these the ones that are the least trade restrictive, and so on? And therefore, disciplines around these, including, I think, the issues, the tricky issues of qualification and so on, that is something that I do think can be worked upon. The broader question of, I think, of how much the services agenda can be pushed in the WTO. Of course, I don't want to sound, and this is not the space, but it's a fact that it depends to a large extent on how members view the WTO itself and the kind of engagement that various members, particularly the more important ones, indulge in. But certainly, I think you, as Hamid rightly said, you allow services trade not to be discussed or not to be allowed at your own peril. If you are not going to discuss it, and I think everybody is a loser. And that I agree, I think, wholeheartedly with Hamid. It's something that is going to become the mainstay. It is already the mainstay of so many domestic economies. It's increasingly going to become the mainstay. Maybe even a time will come of sort of almost parallel, being parallel with merchandise trade. And if you are not going to be up to it in the WTO, you obviously face the consequences that Hamid has said. Just 2 words on, I think, where the developing countries see themselves. I think the developing economies see two. One, I think, the importance of the services economy. I think that developing countries now, I think, are perfectly aware of. And I think the power of the services economy, not only in global trade, but even if you see, domestic, whether it's financial inclusion, whether it's payment of, direct benefits, it's immense. So the benefits of services and digital trade and so on, and the technologies is immense. And they have, I think, many developing economies, including my own, have reaped the benefits. So therefore, they do understand. The second is they do intend, having sort of not yet probably moved up the value chain, particularly as far as data is concerned, in terms of, huge volumes of raw data are generated in all these countries, in all economies. But the ability to sort of process, analyze them, and convert them into digital intelligence, that's the challenge. And that's where I think developing economies look for a little bit of policy space. There's always this balance. At the other extreme, if you have a belief that I just need policy space and therefore I do not engage, I think that's not the way to go. That certainly does not help either you or the rest of the world. So I certainly think that these are the areas that certainly will, I think, merit attention. To what extent, I think, they will come in the WTO, as I said, depends very much on both the political willingness, not just of services, but about the future of the WTO itself. But once again, thanks. And I think these are some of my sort of opening views on some of the questions you raised. They are indeed very, very broad, and it's difficult, of course, to try and do justice in 10 minutes to such a broad topic. But once again, thank you.
Thank you very much, Samantha, for highlighting a number of areas where WTO should be focusing on, and highlighting what are the interests of developing countries in all of these. And yeah, it's very rich and enlightening and difficult to to summarize and to recap. I'll just try, and certainly you highlighted a number of divergencies, and also call for focusing on digital trade, and also maintain a balance between reaching binding agreements, but at the same time to allow progressive liberalization and regulatory collaboration, giving policy space, and also important to increase regulatory collaboration within WTO, and also not only that to address concerns that cross-border trade, but also to strengthen the capacities and dealing with the digital divide in domestic economy. And you also echoed Hamid on a number of issues relates to digital trade, and also the importance of data flow, and also the capacity building for developing countries if they do engage in the digital trade. And also you have highlighted one point, and which I think very interesting, is that while we successfully concluded the negotiations on the reference paper, there is still scope to do more, as GATS has the built-in mandate, and so there is a room to go even further. And then lastly, the two very important observations that you made is that the power of services, not only for trade, but also for the moving up to the value chain. And also I will just end with what you said at last, is services is the future of WTO. Thank you very much. And so now I will come to our third panelist, Mr. Stuart Harbinson. Stuart is a fellow of the European Center for International Political Economy in Brussels, and the Asia Global Institute in Hong Kong. And Stuart has served as a senior Hong Kong government trade policy official, and was the negotiator in the 1980s and the 1990s. He represented Hong Kong and the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region of China at the WTO for 8 years, in which capacity he also chaired some of the WTO's key councils, committees, and negotiating groups. He subsequently became chief of staff and the special advisor to the former WTO Director General Subachai. And then based in Geneva, Stuart is an independent consultant on international trade, and also advises clients periodically on behalf of Hume Bruffy, a global communications agency. Stuart, I still remember the time when we participated in the Doha round negotiation 15 years ago. It's a long time, so very good to see you. Thank you very much for agreeing to participate in this event. So I would like you to add your perspective on what are the issues that the WTO should avoid getting involved in. This is another perspective, and different perspective from the questions that I raised to Hamid and Sumanta. So what WTO should avoid getting involved in certain issues and why. And since WTO is a member-driven organization, the Secretariat is at the disposal of our members. And so as a former senior Secretariat official, I'd like to ask you, how can the Secretariat best support the work on the key services issues for the future? Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Xiaolin. It's great to see you again, and also an honor and a privilege to take part in this roundtable alongside Hamid and Samantha, whom I remember well from his Geneva days. Great to see you again, Samantha. So you've asked me to talk a little bit about what the WTO shouldn't do. So it's a kind of negative listing process that it seems that I'm involved in, or maybe it's a positive listing of negative elements. I'm not sure, but anyway, I've thought of just 3 or 4 points. I must say, I don't have the depth of expertise in services that Hamid and Samantha have. But I've always taken a great interest in the services negotiations in the WTO, both as a representative and in the Secretariat. And I've actually been deeply disappointed, I must say, as I think probably Hamid and Samantha are as well, about the lack of traction and progress in services negotiations over the last 20, 25 years. So it's really a great shame. But I suppose the sort of the light at the end of a tunnel, in a way, is that I think there is, as Samantha said, now a much better realization amongst the broader membership of the vital importance of efficient services if anybody's going to have a competitive economy. So, and I think also, because there's been quite a lot of analysis of services over the years in various think tanks, as well as the Secretariat, that we have a better toolbox now for coming back to services negotiations. But to get on with my short negative list of what the WTO perhaps should avoid, I mean, obviously the first point I would make, I would say, would be to avoid controversial issues that might suggest somehow that the WTO is engaged in an exercise of imposing universal standards and undermining public services, because we know that there's been a lot of misunderstanding in this area. This is not what the GATS is about, as we well know. And of course, I won't go into an explanation of that. I think everyone would understand that, but clearly that's not what the WTO is about. And I think the positive listing of commitments in the WTO in a multilateral setting is a good thing, because we're dealing with a highly diverse range of members, and we need to be able to accommodate multiple speeds, I think. So that's the first point I would make. You know, there's a difference between liberalization on the one hand and deregulation or privatization on the other hand. So that's something that we must always bear in mind. Secondly, I would say, given where we are now, maybe we ought not to be over-ambitious in restarting services negotiations in the near future, hopefully before or after MC12. Maybe we should not tackle the most complex issues first. And I like very much Hamid's point, which I think Samantha also backed up, about binding the status quo and reducing the gap between WTO commitments as they stand now and what is actually happening on the ground. I think that's a good starting point. It doesn't sound very ambitious, perhaps, but I know from my own interaction with the private sector that actually, as Hamid said, they place a very high value on this and on the legal certainty that would be thereby conferred. So let's not underrate that. And I think it's a really good starting point. My third point, I think, would be maybe we should try to avoid what I rather crudely call Geneva isolation syndrome, which is that you have a bunch of trade officials, some of whom are not actually from trade ministries, but from foreign ministries, who are tackling these very, very complex services subjects. Sometimes I have a feeling, I hope I'm wrong, in a bit of a vacuum, in the sense that they may not be getting the full backup from capital, but on the other hand, in the Geneva missions, everybody's focused on how the various issues in the WTO balance against each other. So we all know from history that services has been held hostage on many, many occasions by other subjects, which are perhaps of lesser economic importance. And another aspect of this, what I call Geneva isolation syndrome, is that based on my personal experience, and Hamid's heard me say this before, I mean, I was involved in the basic telecoms outcome in the 1990s. And it was very clear to me from that experience that actually the driving force in the negotiations were, they were regulators from capitals. The Geneva people and the trade people, what we did was relate that to the WTO setting. But actually the substance of the negotiation was regulators from capitals negotiating the telecoms reference paper. So I think we need to bear that in mind. And if we can do anything to improve the involvement of capital-based officials and regulators in WTO negotiations, I think that could be beneficial. And then final point on my avoid list, I've written down here, let's avoid the sterile debate over multilateralism and plurilateralism. I mean, my impression very much is that most of those countries that have been involved in the JSIs, for example, on services domestic regulation and e-commerce, they would much prefer to do it in the multilateral setting. But out of frustration, they've moved slightly off campus and have been doing their own thing to some extent, although very much closely related to the WTO and feeding back into the WTO. So I can't see that a debate over the rights and wrongs of the JSIs will lead anywhere. It will be a sterile debate and it will just hold things up. So the trick from my point of view is to get the multilateral process moving, and then people will be less inclined to do that sort of thing. Charlene, you also asked how the Secretariat could support that, and that's a really big issue. I think I'm probably running a bit out of time, but my perspective is that we need a sort of confidence building process in services negotiations in Geneva, and to get started, get some traction, get a bit of momentum. I think the Secretariat can be instrumental in that. For example, and probably the Secretariat has already done this, I'm sure they've already done it, in fact, you know, analyzing the gaps between the existing WTO commitments and the status quo on the ground. Particularly, I mean, we might relate this to environmental services or environmentally related services and digital trade, perhaps. So that would be very helpful. I've got a question here that I've noted down. Could the Secretariat help to establish what I might call expert groups, for want of a better term, which would stimulate the involvement of capital-based experts and regulators in the WTO in a non-negotiating environment to start with? So just getting them together. And quite often regulators love to be in contact with each other. So they might be tempted to do that. I think UNCTAD has actually had a bit of success in that through its intergovernment expert groups. in various other sectors. If we could relate that directly to trade in services, that might be a way to stimulate outside interest in what the WTO can do. Thirdly, and Sumanta mentioned this, but it's a really, really big issue, is technical assistance and capacity building. I mean, I've been involved in recent years in technical assistance and capacity building projects with very small developing countries. I try to talk to them about the JSI on e-commerce and everything that's going on in there, and it's just impossible. They don't have the boots on the ground in Geneva to be able to cover these issues. They don't have the expertise, and maybe back home, you know, they lack even basic rules and regulations in some of these areas. So there's a mammoth gap that needs to be filled. And I'm sure the Secretariat is already doing a lot in this area, but there is undoubtedly a great deal more that can be done. So I think I better leave it now, Xiaolin, if I may. But as I say, just to wind up, I think we're better equipped now than we ever have been to get moving on services in the WTO. And you know, let's get the ball rolling and gradually build up some momentum, long needed and long delayed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Again, your presentation is also very stimulating and thought-provoking as well. And you have also reinforced a few points that Hamid and Sumanta have emphasized, and your experiences and advice as a former senior secretariat official is also very insightful and resourceful. And also, just to quickly repeat a few highlights that you have emphasized, and I like your approach. Maybe that's because we raised the question and ask you to offer a different perspective from different angle. So you adopted a negative list approach. I like it very much. And also you sounded upbeat as well as Sumanta and Hamid, is that we do see a bit of light at the end of the tunnel. So that is again sound very upbeat and confidence building. And also you have focused on a few areas where WTO should avoid. And I think like we used to say that perhaps we should not all the time confront those very difficult issues. Maybe we should avoid some of the controversial topics that might not very quickly get some convergences among members. So to build the confidence, maybe we could start with something less controversial. And also your point of saying that liberalization does not mean deregulation. And so there is a lot of room for members to collaborate on the regulatory front. And also some of the approaches that you suggested are also very useful for the members and also for the Secretariat to reflect upon, is that to start something like binding the status quo from the services commitment, and also to provide some legal or ensure legal certainty by implementing the domestic regulation reforms and disciplines, and also that we should to help members to avoid the stereotype of mentality and over the issues about multilateral track vis-a-vis plurilateral approach to negotiation. And also the Secretariat has a lot, can do a lot in supporting members to build the confidence and serve as a honest broker, especially in some of the issues that might not get easier for members to agree to. And also you have mentioned and reinforced some of the areas that Hamid and Sumanta had already touched upon about digital trade and about support to environmental goods and services negotiations, and perhaps to explore some ideas of like establishing export group that would involve capital-based regulators and capital-based officials. Finally, and last but not the least, is that development is the central at the core of all WTO agreements and also the current and the future WTO negotiations. So technical assistance and capacity building is the integral part, or I would say blood and the butter of the multilateral trading system that would allow to offer or help the developing countries to increase their participation in trade in services. So these are all very good thoughts and very good suggestions, and for us to further reflect and get them implemented. So thank you very much for all your very stimulating and very rich and thoughtful, resourceful, informative presentations. So now I think I wanted to pick up a few questions from the chat box and ask panelists if they are if the questions in the chat box are pertinent to our first round of interventions. So let me see. Okay, so this is one question. Whoops. This is one question for Stuart. It says from Cecilia Risolo, and which says, virtuality and hybrid meetings have been of great help to increase participation from capitals, especially for developing members. Would Mr. Harbinson suggest keeping this modality despite sanitary measures have been relaxed? So yeah, the question is for Stuart.
Well, thank you very much for the question, Cecilia. It's a very good question, actually. Quite interesting. Yeah, I mean, based on my experience over the last couple of years, and as I said, my involvement with some technical assistance and capacity building projects, I think there's a huge role for virtual meetings or hybrid meetings in the WTO setting, perhaps particularly of this nature. And also, you know, I did say when I gave my initial remarks that we needed to involve capital people more in certain settings, and I think we can use the technology to do so. That would be great, and save a lot of money and pollution on travel as well. I think there are limitations when it comes to negotiations, perhaps, and taking decisions. I know that's been raised by a number of members in the context of discussions about MC12, for example. So that gets a bit more complex when you get down to actual negotiations and possibly decisions. That needs a lot more thought. But I think in terms of contacts, discussions, obviously technical assistance, capacity building, and maybe, you know, I talked about the possibility of these expert groups involving regulators and capital-based officials. Yes, why not? I think that would be a big help. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Stuart. There's a question for Hamid. The question is, most of the domestic regulation disciplines resulting from the JSI are soft commitments to the extent possible, for example. In your view, what would be the strongest feature of those disciplines? Over to you, Hamid.
Thank you, Xiaolin. It's a good question. I think the latest domestic regulation disciplines have come as a breath of fresh air because there was nothing before. I would not say that they would live up to the ambitions of enthusiastic services negotiators. They address mainly two sets of issues: transparency and simplification of procedures. Now, of course, a lot of the provisions there are what I would call soft law, best endeavors. This is true, but I would not dismiss the value of having such provisions at all, because having provisions like that give a sense of direction to members, or at least those who subscribe to those disciplines, about the desirable form of good governance that they should aspire to. And having provisions like that, let's not forget, what we're talking about here is commitments to be scheduled, commitments to be inscribed in schedules, which means that in future rounds of negotiations, there can be another layer of improvement to the same commitments which are scheduled today by turning some of them into legally binding obligations, as opposed to best endeavors. Now, the strongest aspect actually of those disciplines, to answer the question in a concise way, is the disciplines themselves. That we do have disciplines, because in terms of legal enforceability, yes, you might desire more, and particularly on questions of transparency and administrative procedures, we've rarely seen legal disputes or litigation on questions like that. But these are very, very important provisions, as I said, that give a sense of direction towards what is considered to be good governance. I see it as the start. I see those disciplines as the start and not the destination. Xiaolin.
Thank you very much, Hamid. I just wanted to add, I forgot to mention who posed this question is from Mr. Fabien Saiz. Thank you very much for your question. Now I have another question. Let me see, who should I pose to? But I will just read it. And it's from Mr. Wu Rashid. He asked, there are a whole lot of issues covered in the modern era FTA, such as authentication and digital certification, online consumer protection, electronic supply of services, unsolicited the commercial economic electronic messages, personal data protection, Whereas there is no specific agreement to cover on these issues under the purview of WTO. Do you think some specific agreement coverage are needed to address these issues, which could be used as the baseline for the developing and the least developed countries? So I guess this probably can be posted both to Hamid and also to Samantha.
If I may start here, because I think it's a very interesting question, because it raises a broader issue that I think so often is absent from the discussions. It relates to one of Stewart's negative listing about what we should not do. And it's one of the things we should not do in trade agreements, not just in the WTO, is to set regulatory standards. Trade agreements are not standard-setting instruments. The trade negotiators cannot set standards on what would be an appropriate level of privacy protection or online consumer protection. The only thing that a trade agreement can include on those issues is a matter of principle, that you shall have a privacy law. Exactly like in the reference paper on telecommunications, it says you shall have an independent regulator. But it does not cross that line to say how you're going to do this or what the content of such a law or such an institutional arrangement should contain. So do we need a separate agreement on these matters inside the WTO? I would say not really, because there is another element of distinction here, I think, which we need to keep in mind, and that's the distinction between some of those FTAs and the WTO. A lot of those FTAs of the so-called new generation actually are more than just trade agreements. They're economic integration agreements, which also cover integration and developing regulatory compatibility on matters other than trade, be it environment, be it questions about doing business, because some of those agreements are not just about trade, they're about investment, they're about other types of cooperation as well. So this direct comparison between FTAs and what's in the WTO needs to be taken with a grain of salt, because in the WTO we talk about trade, and there are only two forms of trade: trade in goods and trade in services. And this is why the ongoing JSI on e-commerce would have to face a fork in the road at some point about whether the outcome that they are seeking is an outcome that would be scheduled under the GATT and the GATS, would lend itself to that approach, or would they want to create a new standalone agreement which actually would raise a set of questions about the treaty architecture of the WTO itself, and how such a new agreement would also relate to the GATT and the GATS on the trade side, and whether such a new agreement would cover matters that go beyond trade and services, such as in FTAs. So all these are questions, you know, as a lawyer, I would think, well, anything is theoretically possible. It depends on what you consider to be the wise thing to do. But if we're looking at the WTO structure as it is today, I don't think if you want to cover just trade, then I don't think you would need a separate agreement. You would need regulatory disciplines on those matters that would relate to trade in goods and trade in services as they are defined in the GATT and the GATS. So back to you, Xiaolin.
Thank you, Hamid. So now I give the floor to Samantha.
Thanks.
I'd like to add a few words.
Yeah. Very briefly, I think, and I did mention this, that as far as, the question relates to all kinds of regulatory frameworks that you need to build. And I said that there is huge divergence in both in the development of these regulatory frameworks domestically and in the perspective with which a country wants to sort of regulate these. And therefore, I I tend to agree with Hamid that the question of having a separate agreement in the WTO or trying to sort of harmonize this on these basic issues is not only futile, I think it's also what words of wisdom Stuart said. They're so controversial that they're just best left aside. I don't think any purpose is going to be served by trying to do it. Now, I agree that whether in the existing architecture something can be done. Now, that, of course, is a matter that requires much deeper thought and analysis. But if there is something which is certainly not in the realm of sort of wanting to harmonize all these regulations or creating standards, but something else, then there is a possibility. But the other point, I think, and the other question also I saw is related. Certainly, they are going to happen in the so-called comprehensive economic partnership agreements or comprehensive economic cooperation agreements that has become the nomenclature of most FTAs these days. And in a sense, I would say that if in some sense regionally or in some of these FTAs you can experiment with softer options, you get a chance to sort of set your own regimes in place. There's possibly nothing much wrong in doing that, but of course based on the kind of divergence there is and the kind of disciplines there are on these issues in these so-called CEPAs or CECAs is huge. From simply not even best endeavor, even I would say softer than best endeavor, to absolutely the other extreme, where you have complete sort of, I would say, you have no ability to sort of have the policy space, and you have no restrictions that you can do either on data localization and so on. So therefore, I think the real issue here is that most economies, and I'm here again speak from the perspective of developing economies, are still struggling domestically with their own domestic experiences. And I think it's just too early days to kind of look at bringing this into a binding multilateral or even a sort of binding plurilateral framework. So I don't think the day has come. We need to sort of in some sense experiment and find a way with these laws. That's the way it's happened in many of the other things as well, and I think we need to give time.
Thank you very much, Samantha. I think I shouldn't launch a cold call, but I just wanted to make sure that Stuart have whether to would like to add a few points or a few words to this question.
Not really, Xiaolin. I very much agree with what Hamid and Samantha said. Particularly, Hamid's point is that the WTO is not there to set standards, but of course there are, I suppose, some criteria about how domestic regulations are framed in terms of impartiality and transparency and all of that sort of thing, and the normal WTO criterion of being not more trade restrictive than necessary, I suppose, would also perhaps be relevant. But absolutely, I mean, I think countries have the right to regulate themselves, and they do regulate themselves, and they just need to ensure there are no discriminatory spillovers. I guess that's basically it.
Thank you, Stuart. And I have the last question in the chat box from Mr. Susanna Mayer. The question is for Samantha. It seems that for many WTO members, particularly for developing countries, as the case of Mercosur members, the process of advancing in the negotiation of e-commerce seems more in the direction of RTA. So the question is for you, and to see how you feel about this, and yeah, what are some of the experiences that you wanted to share with the participants? Thank you.
Well, I think to some extent in the previous question, all of us in some sense answered this. And as I said, my own sense is that it's best while this seems to become the norm, this is becoming the norm, but my own sort of personal opinion is that you need to go a bit slow on this and be a bit cautious on this, because it's sometimes if you jump in too early into the bandwagon and have in some sense more binding kind of disciplines in these FTAs, you may sort of, I would say, bind yourself in a situation which you may not want. And therefore, but if it's softer things that might actually help the development of disciplines domestically and use these sort of comprehensive partnership agreements to further that, sometimes you do that because that's a negotiation strategy that you follow. That's perfectly fine, but I certainly do feel that full binding disciplines even in the FTAs on these issues is possible. And here we are talking about developing countries, and while I do not have the full range of experience of how the Mercosur countries actually are sort of faring on the regulatory front on each of these areas, but my own sort of view would be that it's best to be slightly more cautious and longer term oriented in this matter. So that would be my personal opinion.
Thank you very much, Samantha. So now this is the end of our question and answers around the first round of interventions. So now we come to the second round of interventions, and I will give the floor to the panelists. And because this second round is for the panelists to comment on each other's interventions in the first round. So let me offer the floor firstly to Hamid and Sumanta to add any views shared on the views shared, and also to comment on ways in which the WTO Secretariat could support the work related to the future services policy endeavor and this work in the WTO, and also on what are issues for which the WTO is not the best forum to deal with. And of course, after Sumanta and Hamid shared their views, and to Stuart, we would like to see if you will add any comment to the interventions from Hamid and Sumanta. To be very honest, and I think that we wanted to use the time in a way when the panelists are around. So we try as much as possible to understand your perspectives on all these very important issues. It seems a little bit back and forth, but I still think that you have a lot more to offer, to share, even if the questions seems to be similar. So now the floor is for Hamid, and then Sumanta, and then Stuart.
Well, thank you so much, Chairman. I would be very quick. There are basically 3 points that I want to comment on. The first is to pick the point that Samantha mentioned about the digital divide. The digital divide is a reality that we see every day, and it's been actually accentuated very much by the COVID situation. And the point I want to raise here and invite everyone to think about is the extent to which services trade negotiations can contribute to efforts to bridge the digital divide. There are obvious points, I won't go through them all, ranging from the predictability and stability of regulatory conditions that would attract foreign direct investment, that would feed into building infrastructure and building telecoms capabilities and training human resource capital and all this. There's so many things that can be done, and we've seen that before. There are also benefits that could be coming from the regulatory reforms associated with negotiations. So the digital divide is a reality, and I think there is a tremendous contribution that negotiations on services can make to bridging the digital divide. The second point I want to comment on is what Stuart mentioned about the Geneva isolation syndrome, which I think is a very, very serious problem. It's a lot more serious, I think, than we think, because there is the sort of WTO Geneva bubble now, which seems to be removed from reality. And it's been exacerbated by the fact that the kind of substantive conversations inside the WTO among delegations and councils and committees and so forth are happening less and less frequently. And that is even making the conversations inside the WTO more disconnected from the realities outside, particularly since the realities are changing at a tremendous pace. And Stuart's example about the telecoms negotiations and how actually the involvement of telecom regulators was so critical. They're the ones who negotiated the reference paper. And a similar situation happened with financial services. Now, in '97, we could not have concluded the negotiations without the engagement of regulators. That's why devising those sort of modalities for I think, expert group idea is a wonderful idea. But there's got to be a way where in this sort of increasing world of complexity of trade policy issues and the regulatory interface, we need to be able to have more and more engagement with regulators and specialists. The last point I would refer to is the big institutional challenge of technical assistance and capacity building. And it's a lot bigger than we think. You take a step back and you look at the system, the reality is in the WTO, you have 164 members that have equal legal status and equal rights, yet very unequal capacity to negotiate. What you get is blockages. Why? It's not because they don't want to negotiate, but because they don't know why should they negotiate. And sometimes they might know, but they don't want to get into negotiations because they don't have the capacity, and the capacity is not in the capitals as well. They don't have a back office back in the capital which would do the analysis and do everything that relates to how do we appraise an issue that is coming up in the negotiations from a national interest perspective. All these things require a different approach, I think, by the WTO to technical assistance and capacity building in order to help developing countries negotiate more effectively, participate in the negotiations more effectively, not just capacity building by explaining to them what the current agreements say. Now, this actually is going to be terribly important going forward. And the lack of engagement by the WTO Secretariat, and I was there and we suffered from this for many years, is due to what we consider always to be the political correctness, that the WTO Secretariat is neutral and impartial and all this. But I think there has to be a tight professional rope that the Secretariat can walk in order to enable developing countries to negotiate more effectively and participate more effectively, while still maintaining the Secretariat's impartiality. Because otherwise, the stage is left to one side of the debate that comes from organizations that actually claim to be pursuing the developing countries' interests and always advising them not to participate in negotiations. So that's all from my side. Back to you, Chalin. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hamid. And yeah, now the floor is yours, Samantha.
Very briefly, just a couple of points. One, of course, is a point that I wanted to sort of, in some sense, support what Stuart Harbinson said about, there might be this temptation to try and change the basic architecture of GATS, particularly issues like progressive liberalization, positive listing, unlike the negative listing that Stuart did. And I think that's a temptation that is just not going to lead anywhere. And you just leave it at that. If you are going to tinker around, you've done it in your FTAs, in your comprehensive economic partnership agreements, but if you try to change this basic architecture of GATS and bring in experience from outside into any future services negotiations, I think you are doomed. So that's the first point I would make. I think that's a suicidal attempt. That's not going to work at all. The second point on, this issue of binding status quo, and I know we've had this debate for a long time, and I just wanted to bring in two perspectives here. One is, of course, and this is a perspective that many developing countries have particularly sort of pointed to, that the issue, the fact that they are in a sense, still developing, the fact that they are, progressively, autonomously liberalizing, and the extent of autonomous liberalization that they have done, particularly in their FDI policies. We all know that most of them are in the business of actively encouraging FDI in their own domestic economies, both to bring in technology, capital management, and so on. And therefore, the kind of autonomous liberalization, if they were to bind status quo, would be far more than countries which have already reached, in some sense, the end of the road, in the sense that they've already liberalized enough, and therefore the extent of autonomous liberalization that may have happened is much lower. So there is a certain truth. This is a fact, and therefore when we look at any binding of status quo of this kind, this is something that needs to be factored in. The second is, while it may not be possible to sort of do this across the board, can we do it in areas where members are more comfortable? So that's a second way of looking at it. These are just two perspectives. For example, something on the actual cross-border delivery, and we know that some kind of restrictions, in fact, have now, technology has made them, completely, I would say, irrelevant to some extent because of the way technology has happened. So can we look at those kinds of restrictions which don't exist, and can we bind the status quo there? So that would be the second point. The third one, I think, and I completely agree with Hamid and Stuart on this issue of, increasingly, in a sense, it always was, trade is complex, and the sort of impact it has, particularly on the regulatory side, and therefore the kind of stakeholders that are involved in actual trade policies are far more than just the trade negotiators. And that's the challenge. How does the WTO as a collective body ensure that, and the two experiences that they added, my own experience, and I remember Hamid saying this when I first joined, and I was jokingly talking about Mode 4, and he said there were four countries in the room, India, Pakistan, Egypt, and Hamid. And, and one of the biggest problems was that the immigration people who do a lot of, of the policies were never involved. So there was an attempt, of course, it didn't sort of, to involve, the immigration people, so on, in the Mode 4 negotiations, particularly in some of the plurilateral groups that were set, and they did happen, and they did come, and they did involve themselves. So I think there is a lesson to be learned here, and I completely agree that that's certainly something. While there are logistic issues, there are huge problems for developing countries even more if the bandwidth of people who are involved is increased. But that's where maybe virtual meetings to some extent can come to a help. So those would be my sort of just a few words of, my opinion on some of these issues. Thanks.
Great. I'm conscious of time, and before I give the floor to Stuart, may I ask Alicia, and think that we can extend by 5 minutes?
Yes, indeed, please. I think we need some concluding remarks as well. So
okay.
Go ahead.
Thank you very much. So over to you, Stuart.
Thanks very much, Shaolin. In fact, very little to add, I think. Just maybe 3 very quick points, but they're really simply reinforcing what's already been said, I think. And Samantha's point about binding the status quo, I agree with what he said. I mean, it sounds like it's a sort of easy thing to do, binding the status quo, but it's not. Politically, of course, it's not, and substantively as well. So even in such an exercise, we would have to be careful, I think, to draw up a balanced agenda for that, so that there's something in it for everyone, and the outcomes are something that everyone can share. Secondly, I can't agree more with what's been said by us all, I think, about technical assistance and capacity building. I think that's an absolutely vital point. And then thirdly, we've talked, I think, in some of the questions have been oriented towards JSIs and FTAs. And it remains to be seen where they lead. But it is going on. It's a reality, and it's fine with me. I mean, we've had the same thing in FTAs in other areas of trade. Are they contributing to trade, or are they diverting trade, and all of that? So it's the same argument. I don't have a problem with the FTAs and the JSIs, as long as the WTO is moving. I mean, I think this is the key point. Otherwise, as Hamid said, we end up with regulatory divergence. So let's get multilateral services negotiations moving slowly to start with, and build on that. And let's avoid it just being a political football in Geneva, as unfortunately seems to have been the case too often over the last 20 years. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Stuart. If Alicia would agree that I probably ventured to abuse my power being a moderator for the session, so I would skip the picking up the questions again from the floor, given the time constraints. Sorry that we haven't been able to cover all your questions, or if you still have the questions from the participants, we will pass them to our panelists and give you their comments in writing afterwards. So I think it's time to wrap up now. And so let me say a few words, and then after that, I would also give floor to Alicia to say a few words. It's a great session and great discussion, and we certainly learned a lot from our panelists, and also the participants have the opportunity to raise their questions. So I hope that the participants find the discussion today useful and reinforcing what you have been discussing in the Virtue Executive Trade Policy course in the last few days. Looking ahead, and I have one anecdote which I think might be interesting to share here. A few days ago, someone wrote to me asking if I can direct them to where they can resort to high standard international rules in order for them to make comparative studies with their domestic rules and regulations. To me, this anecdote suggests that the WTO principles and rules have stood the test of time and still serve as the global benchmark for domestic reform efforts. At the same time, WTO needs to adapt with the passage of time in order to effectively respond to the transformative changes in the 21st century. In this context, on both fronts, from the Secretariat, I would like to say that we are at your service. So finally, before I close, I'd like to thank all for your active participation and deep engagement. Many thanks to our panelists for your time and great contribution. Many thanks to my colleagues from both Services Division and from ITDC for a wonderful course delivered and the preparation made for today's roundtable. So with this, I'm passing the floor over to Alicia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And indeed, I'd like to thank all 4 speakers, our senior WTO experts and services negotiations, for taking the time to be with us today and for sharing your perspectives and for making this discussion very insightful. And of course, for our participants, many thanks for your questions to make this discussion interactive. And I take the moment to also thank our colleagues from the Trade and Services and Investment Division who have made the training earlier this week possible. And that would be to Antonia, Rosie, and Martin, and Esther for all the preparations and making this module possible, module focusing on trade and services. So we thank you all very much for your collaboration. I just wanted to let the participants know that this session concludes our week on trade and services. We will be providing you with a link to the video recording and also to the evaluation form. So we look forward to your feedback for this module 3. And just as a reminder that next week we'll have a different topic, and we've already sent you the agenda for this topic and a list of recommended readings. And we look forward to connecting with you again live on Monday morning at 9:30. And next week, we will be only seeing you live on Monday, 7 March. So with that, I thank you all. I wish you a good weekend and good continuation to the course to our participants, and all the best for all of our speakers today. Thank you and goodbye.